What's up, guys? Jason Benson here with LoveMoves.Us. Have you ever wondered what adoption looks like through a child's eyes? Like, what's their perspective? And can there be both beauty and pain in adoption? Well, I'm sitting here with my friend Melissa, who was adopted as an infant and is also a current foster parent, to share her story and her perspective. Melissa, thanks for being here and being willing to share with us. Could you just start off by just telling us a little bit about your story and your family and growing up and what that looked like?
Sure. I was adopted as an infant, as you just said. My parents were unable to have kids of their own. They tried for years and it just didn't work out for them. So they decided to adopt through Catholic Charities. After quite a few years, they got my sister. I have an older sister. They got a call that there was a little baby girl available, and they went and picked her up. And then 4.5 years later, they got a call and picked me up from the agency.
So just the two of you then?
Just the two of us.
Okay.
And we are not biologically related. That's usually a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So just the two of us. We grew up in St. Charles. I always like to say I had everything I needed, not everything I wanted, but just had a really, pretty average suburban life growing up.
Sure. When did you find out you were adopted?
This is something that I absolutely love that my parents did for me. I found out when I was about 7 that not everybody's adopted. We have a unique situation where my mom was adopted as well. So adoption was a very normal conversation in our household. But there was definitely a moment, I think I was in 2nd grade, when I learned that not everybody's adopted. And I think that was one of the best gifts as an adoptee that somebody could have given me.
That's awesome. So how did you feel like when you found out you were adopted, or like not everybody was adopted? Like what were your feelings on that?
I don't remember there being like a major aha moment. We had a little storybook, I remember it looked like one of those little golden books, and it was called Why Am I Adopted? And so I remember my parents reading that to me all the time when I was a kid. So I think I've always just had a really healthy view of adoption and that it was a very normal thing. So I think my experience is probably not like a lot of other people's, in that I have always known. I've never questioned if it was a negative or a positive. I kind of wore it as a badge of honor, like it felt special. There was definitely, you realize that you have something that nobody else had.
Did your feelings about that ever change as you got older, or did your perspective change on that ever?
I think it has. I think definitely there's been times where being adopted has brought up a lot of feelings all over the board, especially I think in transitional life stages. When things are changing in your life, you start to think about certain things. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I was at my OBGYN and they asked about medical history, and they had just started doing all kinds of genetic testing to see if you carry certain genes. And I've always been okay with answering questions at the doctor saying, I'm adopted, I have no medical history. But they had me fill out this form about my family medical history. And they said, if you have a family history of breast cancer, your insurance will pay for this testing. And if you don't, you can pay for it out of pocket. And I said, well, I don't know. I was like, I don't know the answer to that question. And what may seem like something small to some people, but also when you don't have your like medical background, it can raise a lot of like uncertainty and a lot of questions. So that's one of the things that came up. And then especially when I started having children of my own, I wasn't able to talk to my mom about her experiences being pregnant. So that was an interesting thing. And I think it was a little hard on her as well, because it's something she had really wanted.
Yeah.
And so she wasn't able to coach me through those things as your body's changing, going through a pregnancy.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to ask her those questions because she didn't know what it felt like.
Sure.
I remember a very intense moment when my oldest was born, and I just remember having an epiphany that he was my first biological relative I met. And it was a very cool but emotional moment that I'm like, this is the first person in my life I've ever met that I shared genetics with. And it was bittersweet, but it was also really, really cool. And something special to share with my own kid.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think people take that moment for granted sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. How did you see or view adoption being viewed by other people in your life? Like friends, relatives, society at large? Like what was your perception growing up of how adoption was viewed by others?
So within my family, and I'm talking extended family as well, adoption was very accepted. And, everybody was very aware of it. My aunt and uncle fostered for a little while, so it was not taboo. But I do remember hearing things about people being adopted and hearing like you weren't wanted, not anything directed necessarily to me, but using it in the context of talking about other people, not realizing that, my background, people would say things about, oh, I could never give up a child, or, how could you love a child that isn't your own? People make those kinds of comments without realizing who might be in the room and who might be reading what they're saying.
Sure, yeah.
And I think another weird thing that comes up is using those same words when talking about animals. A lot of people talk about fostering dogs, or I adopted a dog from the shelter, and and they talk about in the context of abandoned, left on the streets. And so sometimes being an adoptee, when they're using that language, it can be, I almost wish there was a different word for people and animals.
Sure.
Not that I don't love animals, not that my dog isn't a rescue dog, but I wasn't rescued.
Right.
To me, that's a big thing. I wasn't rescued. My biological mother in my situation made a choice, and she chose what she thought was the best option for me.
Sure.
Do I know what my life would have been like? No.
Right.
But she made a deliberate choice at that time. She didn't abandon me.
Yeah.
She made a direct choice of, I think my baby will have a better life in this situation.
Yeah, and that's a great distinction. I think that's one of those things that, unfortunately, like you said, so many people hold this perspective of giving up and abandonment and things, when the reality, especially in our country with regard to domestic infant adoption, is women are making a choice, a conscious, difficult choice for what they want for their child. And that I think needs to be celebrated more so, and not, perpetuating these other stereotypes or myths and things. Have you ever met your biological family?
I have not. I have done both Ancestry and 23andMe, because I thought that would be an interesting.
Yeah.
I also thought it might be interesting, like if I did match with anybody. I would say probably about 5 years ago, I got really curious. I've always been curious. As a kid, I would create these like fantasy worlds, especially when I was in trouble or I was mad at my parents. I would create this fantasy world of who my biological parents were. It was always like a celebrity that like couldn't have a baby because they had a movie to film, or something absolutely ridiculous. But so maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, I got really curious. I contacted the agency I was adopted through. I went through the whole slew of paperwork about contacting my biological parents. And it's a really intense packet. I mean, they make you fill out a lot of information because I had a closed adoption.
Okay.
And they ask a lot of psychological questions about where you are at in life that I never even would have considered. One of the questions was, how would you feel if you found out you were the product of rape or incest? And I kind of like I had to stop the application paperwork or whatever for a little while, because I was like, I don't know.
Absolutely.
Like I had to answer that. I was like, I don't know. I guess I've never thought about that before.
Yeah.
So that was a very interesting like self-discovery process, filling out that paperwork. But I felt like I was in a really good place in life. I think I've always had a very healthy attitude towards my adoption for the most part. Not to say there weren't times I wasn't curious or bitter or whatever emotions became evoked, but I've always had an attitude of gratitude.
Yeah.
And so I reached out to the agency, filled out all this paperwork. I made sure I was in a good place in my life where I wasn't having any major life changes going on. I was married, I had 2 kids, wasn't planning on having any other kids anytime soon. So when I talked to the woman at the agency, which happened to be like 15 minutes away from my house, and then I got information back that my biological mother was not willing to meet me at the time. But one of the things I'd requested was if they contacted her, if she wasn't in a position to meet me, if she'd be willing to receive a letter. I think adoption and biological parents have a really bad stigma in society, and I felt I owed it to her to write her a letter letting her know that I had nothing but appreciation and love for her, and that I was okay. So it took me quite a while. It took me a few months, and then one day I just sat down and write the letter. I had to be in the right mood, and something was calling me, telling me, like, you need to write this letter one day. So I called up the woman who I'd been dealing with at the agency, and I was like, I wrote this letter. And she's like, okay, I'm going out of town, so, like, you know, when I get back to the office in 2 weeks, I'll send it out. And I was like, well, no, it needs to go today.
Yeah.
And that's when I found out it was like 15 minutes from my house.
Okay.
I didn't know that the whole time. I was like, this is really weird, because everything had been through email.
Okay.
And so I found out that their office was like 15 minutes from my house, and I said, okay, this is really weird, but if I drive it to you, like right now, she's like, yeah, I can send it out before.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I leave. So
that's awesome.
I don't know what happened with that. I assume she received it.
Yeah.
But I know I got off my heart what I felt like I needed to say to her about, you know, I'm happy, I'm healthy.
Yeah.
I'm very thankful that that you chose this path for me, and I can't imagine, you know, after having my own kids, that I can't imagine how hard of a decision that would be for you.
Sure.
So I have even more gratitude now.
Yeah.
I think it was really just important for me to make sure that I expressed that to her.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It sounds like it was a cathartic process of writing and processing of the emotions, and
very much so.
Yeah. And still yet a great thing, like, even, I mean, I view that as like a gift you gave her in writing what it sounds like you wrote.
Yeah, I hope it was.
Yeah.
Because I tried to put myself in her shoes, and I think as a woman and a mother, having my own kids, the thought of not knowing where they're at, not knowing if they're good, like, would cripple me, it would wreck me.
Sure.
And so I know that her situation must have been that intense that she felt like that was the best option, was to not raise me.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I owed it to her to say, like, I'm okay, like, you don't need to harbor any, you know, I think I said something like, if you do have feelings of guilt or any of this, like, you don't need to.
Sure.
I'm okay. I don't resent you. I don't hate you. I have nothing but, like, honor and gratitude for you.
Yeah. So I want to get into some of the things that maybe as you were growing up that you wrestled with, because you know, for most of us who are adoptive parents, foster parents, like, we see our kids, you know, at different stages wrestle through things and coming to terms with, or trying to understand and make sense of their history and their biological family and what happened, knowing that there are some specific, you know, developmental stages when there's rapid brain growth that typically signals when those things, you know, when kids wrestle and struggle with those things. I'm curious, you know, what kinds of things, issues, topics did you wrestle with as a child as it relates to your biological family?
There was a lot of questions of, where did I come from? Not necessarily from, like, a physical, like, my parents have always been open, this is the agency, this is how it went down, but, like, what's my background? Like, what's, you know, I'm celebrating these family traditions and these cultural traditions, and I know what they said on a paper, but I'm white, so I could be a lot of different things, you know? So is this my biological background? Is this the kind of cultural things that I would have experienced had I been with biological family? That's always been a question, especially seeing a lot of families celebrate like big holidays and family and cultural traditions. I'm like, is this all just a front? Is this in my DNA? Is this what I would have done in that situation had I been with my biological family? And it's interesting because what the agency had written down for my biological parents as far as my genetic background was actually different than what my genetic screening came back. Not all of it, but I was told I was Irish and Norwegian. And then come to find out I'm like predominantly German. Like there is Irish and Norwegian in there. Irish is like my number 2. But I just thought it was really funny that I was like, oh, most of me is German. It's like, that makes sense, because like I'm not a tiny little girl. Like I was like, now I'm like this like brute German, and I'm like, I probably have like a grandma somewhere that's like pounding dough or something. But yeah, so there was a lot of questions over, is this real? Like, or if there were things that I didn't connect to, it was, am I not connecting to this or this tradition or these family members because I'm adopted? Or is it just because of clash of personalities? And I hate to say that like there was one time that I used it as a weapon against my parents. And I'm not proud of it, because I knew that was where it hurt. And I know my parents' situation, not being able to have kids, like that was definitely like, it was a gut punch. And I'm not proud of it, but you know, you're in those teenage hormonal years, and you're just, I think every teenager gets angry at some point. But I definitely threw it out there. And I think my sister met her biological mother, and she has some siblings. And I watched my parents go through that, and I watched them be hurt by that. And I had to have a conversation with my parents of, me wanting to know about my biological family does not negate my love for you. It's curiosity. And my mom's adopted too, and so she never really had much of a desire to know anything about her biological family. So I think there's also that aspect where her being adopted, she had her feelings, and me being adopted, I had my feelings, and they didn't line up. So when I had curiosity about my biological family, or wanted more information, or wanted to search out, it wasn't necessarily viewed by my parents as like a positive thing. Like I needed to constantly reassure them, like, this isn't, I'm not looking for a new mom or dad. Like that they're not, I'm not looking for that to replace this relationship. I just am curious. You know, I think when you grow up in a household where you're not genetically related to anybody, and maybe sometimes you don't always view things the same way, you wonder how much of that is, you know, biological versus, what do they say, nature versus nurture. You know? So how much of it is nature versus nurture? Because there's so many times my parents and I are polar opposites on things, and things the way we view certain situations. And so I wonder how much of that is. There's definitely been times where I'm like, I know I'm genetically not related to them. Like there's something, like even since I was a kid in me, that they would question why I do things the way I do. And I remember like having that thought of like, knowing like I'm really different than them. Even like from the time I was like 4 or 5 years old. Like kindergarten, there'd be like silly little mannerisms or this or that, and like getting older, realizing like that's probably like something inherently in me that is evoked by certain things in this world that isn't stirred up by other people. And that's okay. There's something inside of me that's different than the parents who raised me, and that's okay. And maybe that happens with biological kids. But I know in my experience I was adopted, so that's what I know. And I know that from a very young age there were just certain things that in me, certain things I was passionate about, that my parents kind of gave me that look of like, where'd she come from? And,
right.
And that's okay.
Yeah. What kinds of things did you wrestle with at like different ages and stages when we talk about the brain growth? Like, so let's just say like at age 8, think about your life at age 8. What were some of the things emotions, some of the feelings you had? Like, what was going on at maybe, second grade, you said, is kind of when you found out not everybody was adopted, but, what other kinds of things did you wrestle with or feelings that you
I think
had when
honestly,
you were
just
8?
sometimes the way I view the world. Like I talked about how my mom had views of her adoption in more of a negative connotation than I did. I'm like the eternal optimist of like, well, maybe, or my mom chose this life for me because it was better for me. Whereas my mom has talked about abandonment a lot.
Okay.
I've always, since I was little, been aware of social justice issues. It's always been, I was in kindergarten, and I remember my parents will still tell this story to this day, that in kindergarten I came home singing about Martin Luther King, like setting the people free. And I was saying they set my people free. Like, and they're like, here's this little blonde-haired white girl singing, oh, Martin Luther King, he set us free, And they thought it was like the weirdest thing. I think that's great. If my little blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids come home and sing that, I'd be like, yes, yes. And they weren't mad about it, but they just kind of didn't get it.
What change did you get like to age 12 and then even like go to fast forward to 16 with regard to
rough years. Junior high.
That's really encouraging to all the parents out there that have 12 and 16-year-olds. We know it's rough. We know.
I would say I was a really good kid. Not that I didn't make my mistakes.
Yeah.
Because I definitely made my mistakes. But I was a pretty good kid. Like, I was pretty on the straight and narrow.
Okay.
90% of the time.
Okay.
I started going to youth group with a friend, I think around 4th or 5th grade. And so in junior high, I was just immersed in like church culture, church world. Mm-hmm. And my mom didn't like it because it wasn't Catholic church. And come to find out later, it's because I was adopted through Catholic Charities.
Okay.
And so I was adopted into a Catholic home on purpose.
Okay.
So she felt like that was very important to continue. That was like one of the things that she felt was very important to instill in me as Catholic values. I remember being exposed more to the world of foster care and adoption when I was going to a Methodist church and being more aware of the need for it, and that it wasn't just this thing for people who couldn't have kids. That was my family situation, but understanding that it was more than just a white couple who couldn't have their own kids.
Yeah.
I had a friend, a really good friend, one of my best friends in junior high, whose sister was adopted from China, and just learning that adoption is not this one box item.
And you felt like you learned that in through youth group in the church that you were going to.
It was very much a conversation about the world outside of St. Charles, Illinois.
Yeah, sure.
That the world existed outside of, St. Charles's little box of.
Yeah.
And maybe it was the area I grew up in. Everything was always about like, it has to look one way. It has to, like, not that you go around telling people if you birthed your child or you adopted them, but like it was never a discussion. It was just, this is my daughter, which I'm glad about.
Sure.
But also I felt like that was a little part of me that made me special. Now my mom feels the other way because her and her brother were adopted, and then way down the line, my grandma got pregnant. A very surprise pregnancy. Okay. And my grandmother would say things like, these are my adopted children and this is my son. So I know that was hurtful to her, but for me, being in a family of only adopted kids, it was almost like a badge of honor. Yeah. I remember like kind of deflecting, but it is true, of saying like, I remember saying to somebody, maybe it was in junior high or high school, I said to somebody like, you could have been an accident, but my parents chose me. Like I was able to use that as like they really, really wanted me. Yeah. They had to do all this paperwork. They had to do all these home studies. They had to pay a lot of money for me. Yeah. Like, you could have been like a one-night oops. And like I was able to use that as a little bit of a weapon of like how much work it took to get an adopted child.
Yeah. That's an interesting perspective that you have, that like I don't know that everybody shares that perspective. If we can maybe go be a little vulnerable here in this next couple of questions and stuff I have for you. What thoughts or feelings did you have as you were growing up related to adoption or your birth family that you kept to yourself, that you didn't feel like you could talk about or that it was safe to talk about?
I don't think I've still said these things out loud, so thanks. I think, and maybe I'm generalizing, but I think every preteen and teenager hates their parents at some point. Maybe there's a select few, but there were definitely times where thoughts would come into my head of, I would be better off with my birth family. They don't get me. They don't understand me. They don't, they're not letting me do what I want. If I was with my birth mom, I could be doing X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I've said those words out loud before.
Yeah.
But there was definitely, especially those hormonal years are so bad.
Yeah.
And your parents can't do anything right.
Sure.
They can try all they want and they can be the coolest parents, but they're still going to do something that is not cool to the teenager. They're there too much. They're not there enough. They're,
Sure.
They're in your face all the time, or they're not giving you enough attention. Like there's never going to be a right way to parent, I think, those kids. And as a mom, I know I mess up probably on a daily basis.
Yeah.
But there were definitely times that those conversations came up, or in my head, not even conversations, but that went on in my head. I think also just in a weird, more, I don't know if it's generalized or very specific, but there's been times I've thought about, like, if I needed an organ transplant, like, I would have to start from scratch, like, not from scratch, but like, I know my blood type, but a lot of times people start with family.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if anything ever happened to me, or even for me, to my kids, I've thought about, like, man, like, my search would be that much harder than people who are genetically connected to their family.
Sure.
So
Sure.
that's something I don't think a lot of people think about, maybe, that aren't adopted. And, science says that, like, it's a better match if you're genetically related to somebody to use that tissue. So
and those are some of the things that people just don't think about, right?
Like, think about it. I had the thought one point of, I would be better off dating within my family, because then I knew I wouldn't be crossing a gene pool. Like, something so silly and so stupid, but I'm like, I could be dating my cousin and I would never know. Not that I would date like any of my adoptive cousins or anything like that, but I was like, technically that's a safer pool to date in genetically than the world. Like, I'm guaranteed to not be biologically related to these people, but there's just some of those weird things. There's just some of those weird things in life that come up that you're like, or the thought has come across of, like, did I ever run into them at the mall? Did I ever cross paths with them? I worked retail, so that's why I said the mall, in high school. Like, did I ever, like, check her out when I was working the jewelry counter? Or, just, I would see people that kind of looked like me and I'd be like, I wonder. And for me, it was never in, like, a longing way. Like, it was never like, I want that. It was just curious. Like, I'm just curious. I'm really, really curious.
Yeah. What do you feel like your parents did well as adoptive parents?
By far, the communication about being adopted. And the amount of times they talked about it and talked about the
Meaning
process.
What? Like, what do you mean when they talked about you being adopted? How did they bring that up, or how did they talk about it? What kinds of things did they say?
When I was really little, it was like the books. What did my parents do well? I think my parents were just very open about adoption my whole life. From one time I was a little kid reading books about it, just mentioning it at the dinner table. They will always tell the story of how my mom was at work when my dad got the call, and she worked at a department store. And so he rushed down with my sister and told her, like, we gotta go, there's a baby. And they drove down to the agency, and my sister, like, found me. So I guess I was crying in a room down the hall. And they let my sister go find the baby.
Okay.
Find her little sister.
Yeah.
So, I think when I think about my kids and I tell them about their birth stories.
Sure.
I think that's a common thing that people talk about. Especially on birthdays, when you were
Yeah.
born,
Yep.
this is what happened.
Yeah.
And so in my family, it was like, when we got the call for you, was a very common phrase.
Yeah.
Brought up. Birthdays, holidays. My mom talks about when I was baptized on the Epiphany. Things like that. It was just brought into normal conversation.
Yeah.
It was never, now we're going to talk about adoption. It was brought up just like you would talk about birthing your own child.
Yeah.
It was never really brought up in the context of your birth family or this, but when we got the call for you. And
Yeah.
I relate that to like telling my kids, when I found out I was pregnant, this is how I told Daddy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was just very nonchalant. I almost think it's better sometimes to not make a big deal. Like, you want it to be a normal conversation, but it doesn't need to be a big conversation.
Sure.
My kids
Sure.
now, I've talked about adoption since they were itty bitties and just brought it up as a normal conversation, because I think when you normalize it and you don't make it a big deal, it takes away the stigma, and it
Sure.
takes away, is it a big deal? Yes, it's a big deal. But also, it shouldn't be a big deal. Like, it should just be so normal, because we live in
Yeah.
a world where there's a lot of babies that need
Yeah.
homes, and there's a lot of kids that need parents that are capable of loving on them the way that they need to be loved. And so when we make a big deal out of it, it's not this big hero savior situation. In my family, I think my birth mom is the one that saved my parents. They really struggled. They weren't able to have kids. And
Yeah.
so she's the hero in the situation. She's the one that made a choice.
Yeah.
And she gave them the gift
Yeah.
of a child that they couldn't have on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What kinds of things do you wish maybe your parents had done differently?
I think if I could coach adoptive parents to do something differently, I think there have been times that my biological parents have been the bad guy. And not really the bad guy, but I felt when I was curious and asking questions, it was shut down at times about my biological family, not about adoption.
Yeah.
But that when there were times I had questions about where I came from biologically, it was kind of shut down. And I know that they don't think she's a bad person. I think there's a little part of them that felt threatened by, there's something that we will never have that she has with her birth mom, even though I haven't met her since I was in the hospital. But there's something that they can never get. They will never have that moment. And it's sad. It is sad. My mom's expressed how she's sad that she missed those first, those first days of my life. She's like, I don't know what you wore home from the hospital. Some people have, I have all my kids' little hats from the hospital, and we don't have those things.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough that I lived with a foster family for just a few weeks when I was first born, and they wrote me a card, and I got to open it when I was a teenager.
Oh, cool.
And they wrote me a note just about how I was a happy baby.
Yeah.
It's something I cherish. I think it's something really neat, and I think it's a gift to my parents as well,
Yeah.
that they get a little glimpse into what my first few days were like.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
And then coming full circle, us being in the foster care world, my husband and I actually got to take care of a little girl home from the hospital while she was waiting for her adoptive parents. They were from out of state, and it was during COVID. And so there was travel restrictions. So we just had her for a weekend. It wasn't anything crazy long, but I took pictures and sent them to the caseworker, and I, I made
awesome.
sure to like put a Post-it on a little baggie and say like, this is what she came home from the hospital in. And I wrote her a little card that said like, this is what your first few days were like. You know, you did this, you did that, you smiled, you know, and I felt it was very full circle that I got to give her parents that glimpse of what her life was like for those first little, first couple days home from the hospital, that they were not legally like allowed to get her yet or see her yet, but I was able to be like, from my experience, I know this is something my parents missed out on, so I'm going to try to give you as much as I can.
That's awesome.
In this little package. And then I got to actually hand her to them, and it was like the coolest. Like,
that's awesome.
I asked the caseworker, I was like, I know this is weird, but can I give them their baby? It's like being an adoptee and knowing what my parents went through. I was like, I know this sounds really weird, but like this would be very full circle for me. Can I give them? And she was like, yeah, of course. Like, you've watched her all week, you know? And so I got to like carry the baby in and be
beautiful.
Like, here's your daughter. Like, and it was just the coolest.
Like, that's incredible. That's awesome.
And had I not had those experiences being adopted, or had my parents not told me those things, or told me how hard some of those things were, I would not have been able to give them that gift.
Going back to what you said right at the beginning there, though, too, with what you would coach adoptive parents, I think if I hear you correctly, like you're saying, don't be threatened by your child's curiosity or questions about their birth family. Like that's a normal thing, and normalize it, and don't be threatened by that, because what I hear you saying is like, my curiosity about them doesn't negate my love for you.
Absolutely.
Right?
No, I think it's hard for us to compartmentalize these feelings. You either want to feel happy or sad, and not at the same time. Like, trying to feel both of those at the same time. So I can have love and gratitude for my birth parents, and also love and gratitude for my adoptive parents at the same time. Like, my mom and dad are my mom and dad. Like, there's no adoptive mom and dad put before it. That's mom and dad. You know, for my birth mother, I do say birth mother, you know, or biological mother. Like, there's a distinction. She's not my mom. She birthed me, but she's not my mom. She's not who raised me. But yeah, there's definitely been times, and I know working in the foster care world, which is different than a traditional adoption, it's very easy to villainize the birth parents. And I know I've done it myself. And it's hard. It's hard to fight that, because there's very direct choices a lot of times in the foster care situation. But right now, what I'm currently dealing with our placements, I have empathy for her. I know she loves her kids. But I also know them being with her isn't safe right now. And so it's a very hard situation. And I defend her to other people. People say things to me all the time of like, well, you know, don't you just want her to get her kids taken away, you know, so you can adopt them? No, I don't. I want her to get better, is what I want. I want her to better herself as a human being. But I also know right now she's not safe. And it's sad, it hurts, it breaks my heart. And I don't know, my biological mother may have been in a similar situation, but she may have had the wherewithal enough to know she couldn't raise a kid at the time. I know she was young. She was like in early college years. I do have like a little snippet of background information. But I don't know if she struggled with mental health or anything like that. But 9 times out of 10, I would say even more than that. I would say 999 times out of 1,000, I think birth parents love their children. They are not the bad guy. They may make bad choices. But they love their children. I think they're probably have been exposed to trauma, and they don't know how to move forward. I think they don't know how to use those skills. They haven't been taught. They haven't had the same resources we've had. So they don't understand how to work through their trauma to parent their kids. But it doesn't make them a bad person.
Sure.
It makes them a person who didn't have the advantages that a lot of us have had.
Yep.
I know a lot of the parents I've worked with probably should have been in care themselves. And so I think there's that constant back and forth, being a foster parent and an adoptee, that wants to see those families reunited.
Yeah.
I want to see, so that those kids don't have those questions their whole life of who am I, where did I come from?
Yeah.
Or I want to see the biological parents and the foster parents have a good relationship. So when those kids have those questions, their parents have access to the answers.
Sure.
I think that's like a perfect world.
Yeah.
I mean, I always say fostering, like in a perfect world, whatever happens to the kids, if they go home or if they stay,
Yeah.
the perfect world would be that we're all involved in their lives.
Yeah.
Like that we have some kind of relationship that we can be together to celebrate these children because we all love them.
Yeah.
And it's not me against you. It's all of us against the world for the kids.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned the word trauma with regard to maybe some birth parents and stuff. I'm curious, how did trust and or fear play a role for you as a child with relationships, with your parents, with friends, with...
Yeah.
How did you see trust or fear play a role?
It's something I'm actually working on currently with a therapist. Trust, fear. I don't know if trust and fear really has always been a theme in my life. Maybe trust, but I think since I was a little kid, I've always felt like I didn't fit in. There's been times I didn't feel like I fit in with my own family. There were times I felt like I didn't fit in at school. Like I talked about being in Catholic school, I felt like I didn't fit in with any of those kids.
Yeah.
And I could say to this day, I still feel like I wouldn't fit in with any of those kids, or the majority of them. And I think part of that goes back to being adopted, of just sometimes not knowing always where you fit in.
So
Like-
even as a white girl being adopted by white parents,
Yeah.
you didn't always
In
feel
the
like
white suburbs,
you didn't feel like you fit in
I
all the
didn't
time.
always feel like I fit in.
Yeah.
Is that because I'm adopted? I don't know. Is that go back to, I very much believe in like trauma is a real thing. I was listening to a podcast today and they were talking about like trauma can be anything. Trauma is when you have like that intense emotional response. So people can have trauma from very different things. And to
Yeah.
one person, it can be, minor, nothing. And to another person, it's this huge thing
Sure.
that's traumatic
Yeah,
to them.
absolutely.
Trauma isn't the event, it's
Absolutely.
our response to an event.
Right. Like, it's interesting because that was actually one of my questions that you already just brought up about any times maybe with your family where you felt different, and you just said like you did. There were lots of times you didn't feel like you fit in. I'm curious if there were like what during your childhood did you find to be traumatic as it relates to maybe your adoption or your bio family, your adoptive family.
I for sure believe in infant trauma, and that being separated from a parent at birth is trauma.
Sure.
I've done a lot of work being a foster parent on trying to be trauma informed, and trying to read and listen to podcasts and watch videos about trauma, take classes on trauma. And something that was very interesting to me that I learned once was about how when a baby's in the womb, they're already getting used to their environment. The things that their mom's eating, which then, translate to smells and things like that. The things that they're hearing, the music they're hearing, the TV shows they're hearing, the sounds if they're in the city versus out in the suburbs, their mom's heartbeat. If their mom had a tense pregnancy, it can cause anxiety.
Right.
Or can lead to children that have anxiety and adults that have higher rates of anxiety because instead of hearing that steady boom, 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 you're hearing an irregular heartbeat. So I very much think that there's trauma when you are separated from your birth parent. Even though our active brain may have no recollection of that being a trauma, I think physically our body has that muscle memory of separation.
Yeah.
think The Body Keeps the Score was it was an intense read, but it was so eye-opening to me as an adoptee and a foster parent about there's things that can happen before you're even cognitively aware of it that cause physical reactions and physical feelings that your body will always remember.
Yeah.
And so to think about any particular event, not really, there wasn't anything major trauma-wise. I mean, I was hit by a car, but that had nothing to do with...
Sure.
Maybe if I wasn't adopted, I wouldn't have been hit by a car. I wouldn't have been crossing the street. But
that would be traumatic, but not as
right, traumatic, but not terms
I guess,
of
as an adoptive parent, I think, especially at those stages I talked about, like at 8, at 12, at 16, where there's intense emotions, there's cognitive development, where they're, processing things as it relates to their story, their adoption.
The thing I can think of that's like an actual event or series of events, because it happened more than once, is in school doing like your family history, family tree.
Yeah.
And not knowing. I had to do this when we went through our foster parenting classes. They had us diagram our family tree, and I was like, how do I do this? I'm like, I don't know how to do this because my family tree is really wonky then.
Yeah.
I was like, well, where do the arrows go for like adoptive family versus biological? And then it's like, do you put the 2 dads here and 2 moms here, or do you put like mom and dad? So in a sense, is it trauma where there was like a significant event that happened? No, but it was events that made my brain start going, I don't know, and feeling very lost and confused of how do I answer this? Do I do my family's timeline when we did like Mayflower, like immigration, Ellis Island stuff, and I remember doing it in class one time where they wanted you to try to trace your family back to coming to America.
Yeah.
Like, where did your family, because there's people who are native, and then there's people who came over, with the Pilgrims, and there's people who came over, not that long ago. There's first generation families here.
Yeah.
I remember having to do a project where we traced how our family came to America. Are you native, do you have native background? Are you from the Pilgrims? Are you first generation, second generation? And I remember not knowing how to answer that question. Being like, well, I could go to my parents and ask them their family history, but that's not my history of how my blood got on this soil.
Right.
And I didn't have access to answering the questions from that perspective. Yeah. And I even, when I did my genetic stuff online in the apps, like my family tree is really wonky. So they're not traumas in the sense of I wasn't abused physically, emotionally, things like that. Yeah. But they're definitely things that I think people who are not adopted and don't have those answers wouldn't realize are questions. Or just the day-to-day, like, oh, your eyes are so beautiful. Where'd you get those from? Like, people, like, who in your family has those eyes? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know who has my, I don't know where I got my eyes from. I don't know where I got my smile from. I don't know. And even sometimes when people would say, oh, you look like your dad, you kind of just chuckle on the inside of like, okay. Sure. You know?
Yeah.
And again, I'm white, so we do all kind of look alike. They're not traumas in the sense that they're big events, but they're things that make you go, like, just make your brain go, It's a little, like, it almost feels like a little jab sometimes.
Something you're thinking
Seems
about.
Seems like a little nudge of like a reminder that.
A little twinge.
That you don't have access to that.
Yeah.
And you probably never will.
Yeah.
The state of Illinois has now passed a law that I can have access to it.
Okay.
I could pay $15 right now and get my unsealed birth records.
Okay.
I've made a conscious choice not to because I reached out through the agency and my birth mother said she didn't want to meet me at the time.
Yeah.
And so I felt like it would be disrespectful to her to do that.
Yeah.
But it's like, I'm still curious.
Yeah, sure.
I want to know.
Absolutely.
And maybe I will one day, but I don't trust myself now to not like stalk her and find her on Facebook and see who she is.
Sure.
But yeah, there's a little bit of trauma in the fact that there's answers you will never get the answer to. And you have no control over it.
Yeah.
You have zero control over any of those things. And you'd be surprised how much it comes up.
Yeah. I want to end by asking you asking this last question that I want to ask everybody, kind of end this with, is what's one thing you wish adoptive parents knew?
The one thing I wish adoptive parents knew was to be honest with their kids. Adoption should not be shameful. It shouldn't be embarrassing. Infertility shouldn't be embarrassing.
Hidden?
It shouldn't be
any
hidden.
information be hidden?
I think when we hide information, it's an implied embarrassment.
Yeah.
And I'm proud to be adopted.
Mm-hmm.
I'm proud of the work it took my parents to get me.
Mm-hmm.
It may not have been the route that everybody takes, and that's okay. I think that's obviously different with infant adoption than it is foster to adopt, and being dually involved in that. But I think it's also important to let your kids tell their stories if they want to, and let them keep it private if they want to.
Yeah.
You know, that you're like, yes, as a parent, it's part of your story, but that's also the start of their story.
Yeah.
And they deserve control over whether or not, what parts of their story they want the world to know.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah.
But at this stage, it's not my job to share their story.
Sure.
But also just giving them the power to feel how they want to feel.
Yeah.
You know, give your kids that option, even if you feel a different way, even if you've lived a similar story, like my mom being adopted and me being adopted. Validate that whatever they're feeling is what they're feeling.
Yeah.
If they're angry one day, let them be angry. It's probably nothing to do with what you did. Like, it's just something going on inside of them that's different than what's going on inside of you, and that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, love them unconditionally, like you would. Don't treat them any differently than you would if you have a family that's blended of biological and adoptive kids. Like, make sure that you're loving all of them equally, which is hard sometimes. I mean, sometimes my kids will say that I paid more attention to our foster kids than I do our biological kids, and sometimes they need it. But really just letting them be who they are.
Yeah.
If they want to find out what their DNA is, don't make them feel ashamed about it.
Yeah.
Let them explore that, because there's something in them that they want.
For sure.
It's something they have control over.
For sure. Absolutely.
And when you're adopted and it's a closed adoption, you have this big black hole constantly like behind you that you will never have access. So if you get a chance to have a little nugget of information and you want it, don't hinder them from exploring that.
Sure.
Even if it's a little scary to you, you know, go on that adventure with them. You know, be like, hey, I'm really curious too, you know, let's learn about this together, because it could be a great opportunity for you guys to bond as well.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't have any German traditions growing up. I haven't really started to explore them, but, you know, I'm like, I'm really interested into going into my genetic history and learning what some of those traditions are that are part of who I biologically am made up of.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's different than what I grew up in.
Absolutely.
And that there can be so many emotions at one time.
Yeah.
If you're mad one day, it doesn't mean you're mad all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it just means you're having a moment. Or if you're sad for a moment. I'm sad that, like, the thought of never meeting any of my biological family can sometimes make me sad.
Sure.
Especially, like, as I'm getting a little older, like, they could die. And then I'll never get that chance. So that thought comes up and it's sad, but it's not, it doesn't mean I don't have love from my family. Sure. My family will always be my family. Yeah. And they can exist in the same world, and they can exist at the same time. Yeah. You know, it doesn't take away from what my parents built, and they did a really good job of building that.
Awesome.
So that would be
That's awesome.
My biggest
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate you being here and sharing so openly and vulnerably. I appreciate it.
Thanks.